The rope burned through Ada Calder's palms before she even understood what she was pulling against. And by the time she understood, the calf was already halfway over the lip of the ravine, bawling into the wind like the whole world was ending, which, as far as the ranch's ledger book was concerned, it very nearly was. She dug her boots into the mud, threw her whole weight backward, and screamed a name into the storm that the storm simply ate. Lightning cracked the sky in half. 41 head of cattle, the last 41 head Silas Calder owned free and clear, were scattering into a canyon that no one from Wickfield had gone into and come back from with anything but bad news in nearly 30 years. If you're new here, stay a minute. Comment the town you're watching from tonight. And whatever you do, don't leave before the end. Because what this woman and this man found at the bottom of that canyon didn't just save a herd of frightened cattle. It saved everything they had left to lose. 6 weeks earlier, the Calder Ranch had still been quiet in the particular way that grief makes a house quiet. A silence with corners. A silence that flinched when a door closed too hard. Ada had married into that silence a year before, and she had married into it with her eyes open. She was not a young bride. She was not, by Wickfield's reckoning, the kind of bride anyone had expected Silas Calder to take. She was broad-shouldered and plain-spoken, and had buried a husband of her own out past the county line, and she had learned a long time ago that a woman built the way she was built survived by being useful. She had learned to carry feed sacks other women wouldn't touch, to set a bone before the doctor arrived, to say what needed saying in 6 words instead of 60. She had learned above all one private rule, and she had never once broken it. She did not cry where anyone could see her do it. Not at her first husband's grave, not at her mother's. Not once in 34 years had anyone living seen Ada Calder cry. Silas had buried his first wife Rebecca 2 winters back, and something in him had gone still the way a well goes, still when the rope snaps and the bucket falls where no one can reach it. He was a big man, quiet in the way that big men can be quiet when they've decided silence is safer than the alternative, and he ran the ranch the way he ran his grief, competently, relentlessly, without a single wasted word. He had a habit, small but noticed by everyone who loved him, of starting a sentence and stopping it right before the soft part. I just wanted to say. He'd begin, and then his jaw would tighten and the sentence would die there, unfinished, like a door left open half an inch and no farther. There were 4 children in that house, and if you had asked anyone in Wickfield to describe them, you would have gotten 4 answers, and every one of them would have been half right and half wrong, the way descriptions of grieving children always are. Nathaniel was 12, and he had appointed himself foreman of a household that had never asked him to be foreman of anything. He rose before dawn to check the water troughs. He corrected his younger sister's manners at the table with the weary authority of a man 3 times his age. He had not, Ada noticed within her first week in that house, laughed once. Josephine was 9, and her fury came off her like heat, off a stove. She slammed doors. She argued with the mule. She had, on Ada's second day in the house, informed her flatly that she was not her mother, and never would be, and then she had gone out to the barn and cried where she thought no one could see, which Ada had seen anyway, because Ada made it her business to see things the children thought were hidden. Wren was 6, and Wren did not speak. Not a refusal, not a defiance, simply an absence, a small girl who communicated in drawings left on windowsills and in the careful, silent way she arranged stones in rows along the porch rail. She had not said a word since the day her mother died, and the doctor had run out of things to say about it. And June was 2, and June cried. June cried in the mornings, and June cried in the evenings, and June cried in the black hours between, and everyone in that house had come without saying so aloud to measure the health of the household by the sound of that crying, the way sailors measure a coming storm by the color of the water. Ada had come into all of it a year ago with nothing but a wagon, a tin cup that had been her mother's, and the rule she never broke. She had not come in trying to replace anybody. She had come in, she told herself every single morning, only to be useful, because usefulness was the only currency she had ever fully trusted. The ranch itself was drowning, and everyone in Wickfield knew it, which was its own kind of cruelty, because there is no privacy in a small town's understanding of your debts. The bank held paper on the Calderland, paper signed 2 winters back when Rebecca's doctoring bills had come due all at once, and the man who held that paper was Aldous Crane, who wore his respectability the way other men wore a good coat, and who had never once, in Ada's observation, said a cruel word that wasn't dressed up first as a kindness. "I only want what's best for the children," he liked to say, standing in the Calder kitchen with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the exposed beams in the thin larder, and everyone understood that what he meant was, "I intend to have this land, one way or another, and I intend for it to look, from the outside, like mercy." Beside him, in the town's estimation, if not in fact, stood Eugenia Prentice, who ran the church charity basket and the sewing circle and, more than either of those things, ran the current of gossip that moved through Wickfield like water finds a crack in a dam. Mrs. Prentice had opinions about the size of Ada's hands, and the plainness of her dresses, and the impropriety, as she called it, at the sewing circle, in a voice pitched exactly loud enough to carry, of a woman like that raising a dead woman's children. She delivered her cruelties wrapped in concern the way Crane delivered his in mercy, and the two of them together formed a kind of pincer that closed slowly over months around the Calder family's peace. The drought had come on top of all of it, the way trouble does, not politely, one thing at a time, but all at once, in a pile. The upper creek that fed the Calder pastures had thinned to a trickle by midsummer, and by the time the leaves started turning, it had stopped running altogether, and Silas had ridden the fence line for 3 days, trying to understand why, because in 30 years that creek had never gone fully dry. Not even in the drought of '71 that old-timers still talked about at the Mercantile. He came back from that ride with a face Ada had learned to read. As trouble, though, he didn't say much beyond, "Crane's put a dam in on the upper section. Says it's on his land. Might be it is." He said it the way he said most things that frightened him, flatly, like a fact laid down on the table, rather than a fear let loose in the room. And then he went out to check the herd, because that was what he did instead of talking about what scared him. The cattle, deprived of the creek, had begun drifting east toward the canyon rim, drawn by some scent of moisture the humans couldn't smell, and Nathaniel had taken to riding out twice daily to push them back, exhausted, saying nothing, because saying something would have meant admitting how frightened he was. And admitting fear was not a thing this household did, not before Ada came, and not entirely after either. It was Josephine, of all of them, who first said out loud what everyone else was only thinking. "We're going to lose the ranch," she announced at supper one evening, in the same flat, furious voice she used for everything. And when Nathaniel told her to hush, she stood up so fast, her chair went over backward, and she said, "Somebody has to say it. Nobody in this house ever says anything true." And then she was gone out the door into the dark, and nobody went after her for a full 10 minutes, which was 10 minutes too long, and Ada carried that guilt around afterward like a stone in her boot. It was Wren who said the truest thing of all, and she said it without a single word. She had begun, in the weeks before the storm, drawing the same picture over and over on scraps of paper she left on the windowsill for Ada to find. A canyon rendered in a child's careful crayon strokes, with a bird in it, and beneath, the bird a shape that might have been water or might have been a fire. Ada could never quite tell which. She left 7 of these drawings on the sill over 3 weeks, and Ada kept every one of them in the drawer of her mother's cup, though she couldn't have said, if you'd asked her, exactly why. The storm came on the 4th Tuesday of that dry season, arriving the way big storms arrive after a long drought, with a violence that seemed almost like an apology for having withheld rain so long. It broke the sky open just past supper, and within the hour, the wind had torn 2 shutters loose, and the cattle, spooked past all reason by thunder rolling down off the canyon walls, had bolted clean through the east fence and were running, 41 head strong. straight toward the one place on the whole ranch that every soul in Wickfield had spent 30 years teaching their children never to follow anything into. Silas was already halfway to the barn before Ada had her boots laced, and she was 2 steps behind him through the mud, and neither one of them said a single word about turning back. Because there are moments in a marriage, even a young one, even one still finding its footing, where 2 people simply move as though they'd rehearsed it. And this was one of those moments. Nathaniel came out onto the porch shouting that he'd saddle up too, and Silas turned back just long enough to say, "Stay with your sisters," in a voice that left no room for negotiation. And for once in his young life, Nathaniel did as he was told, though it cost him visibly to do it. His jaw working the exact same way his father's did, when a sentence went unfinished. The canyon that swallowed the Calder cattle that night had a name once, an old name that the town had mostly stopped using. Widow's Throat, the old-timers called it, on the rare occasion they spoke of it at all, and there was a story attached to the name, half legend and half warning, about a homestead that had gone into that canyon 2 generations back and never come out whole. Nobody remembered the particulars anymore. What they remembered was the shape of the fear, which is often how these things survive long after the facts that produce them have worn away. Ada and Silas rode the rim as long as they dared, and then when the cattle's bawling disappeared down over the edge into the dark, they did the only thing left to do, which was follow. The trail down was narrow and switchbacked and half-washed by the rain already falling, and twice Ada's horse nearly went off the edge, and twice Silas reached back without a word and steadied her, his hand closing hard around her wrist in the dark, a grip that said more than any unfinished sentence he'd ever started. And she held on to that grip the whole way down, and neither of them mentioned it again, not that night and not for a long time after, though she thought about it more than she would have admitted to anyone, even herself. At the bottom, the canyon opened wider than either of them expected, a long throat of stone that curved out of sight to the north, and the rain, funneled by the high walls, had turned the canyon floor into a churn of mud and running water that reflected the lightning in long silver ribbons. The cattle had bunched against a wall of rock a quarter-mile in, calm some now that they'd outrun the thunder's echo, and Silas set to circling them while Ada held the lanterns, and it was in the holding of the lanterns, in the stillness of simply standing still while a man worked, that she first saw it, a shape in the canyon wall that wasn't rock. A straight line where nature does not draw straight lines, half buried under 60 years of rockfall and brush. She didn't say anything at first. She had learned in her 34 years that a woman who spoke every thought aloud, the second she had, it was a woman who got dismissed a little faster each time, and so she held the thought the way she held most things, close and quiet, until she was certain. She walked the lantern closer. The straight line resolved itself, in the shivering light, into the corner of a roof, and beneath the roof, a wall, and beneath the wall, a door, half collapsed, hanging on one hinge, and beyond the door, dark.
"Silas,"
she said, and something in her voice made him leave the cattle circling themselves and come to where she stood. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He looked at the shape the way a man looks at something he has spent years being told does not exist. "That's not on any map," he said finally. "Might be it's on an older one," Ada said. They did not go in that night. The storm was still working itself out overhead, and the cattle needed pushing back toward the trail before the water rose any higher in the canyon's throat. And there is a kind of discipline, hard-won and unglamorous, that says you finish the job in front of you before you chase the mystery beside it. And both of them had that discipline bred into their bones. They drove the herd back up the switchback trail in the last hour before dawn, soaked through, half-frozen, saying almost nothing to each other, and when they came up over the rim into gray first light, Nathaniel was standing at the fence line where he'd been standing, by the look of him, most of the night. He just opened the gate, and something passed between father and son in that silence that Ada understood she was not meant to interrupt. It rained for 3 more days after that, the kind of steady, soaking rain the country hadn't seen in 2 years, and the creek on the upper section, the one Crane's dam had throttled to nothing, came up anyway, fed by runoff the dam couldn't catch, and for 3 days the ranch simply breathed. Ada used those 3 days the way she used most days, in motion, mending fence, salting hides, teaching Josephine to set a proper stitch, though the girl fought her on every single one. And it was on the second of those 3 days that Josephine, without any warning at all, said the thing that had apparently been sitting in her like a stone for a year. "Everybody thinks I'm just angry," she said, not looking up from her stitching. "I know it," Ada said. "I'm not angry. I'm just—" Josephine stopped. Her jaw did the thing. Her father's jaw did. "I'm just scared all the time, and being angry is easier than being scared, because nobody expects you to explain being angry." Ada set down her own needle. She did not reach for the girl, because she had learned already that Josephine did not want to be reached for. Not yet. Maybe not for a long while yet. She said instead, the plain, unsentimental truth, laid gently on the counter between them the way she laid down every hard thing. "Scared is the right thing to be feeling. This is a scary year. But you're not carrying it alone anymore. That part's mine. Now, too." Josephine didn't answer, but she didn't slam anything either, and she finished the row of stitches, crooked and imperfect, and left it on the table where Ada would find it. And Ada understood that for a girl like Josephine, that crooked row of stitches was its own kind of confession. Wren left a new drawing on the sill that same evening, the canyon again. But this time the door was drawn in, plain as anything, a small brown rectangle beneath the bird, and beside the door, for the first time, a second small figure that might have been a person. And Ada stood in the kitchen a long time looking at that drawing, feeling the particular cold that comes when a child has somehow known something before the adults around her had words for it. They went back down into the canyon on the 4th day, once the water had receded enough to make the trail passable. And this time they brought Nathaniel, because Silas had decided, in the quiet way he decided most things, that his son had earned the right to see whatever there was to see. And Nathaniel rode down that switchback trail, sitting straighter in his saddle than Ada had ever seen him sit, 12 years old, and trying so hard to look like it didn't matter to him. This trust, though it plainly mattered more than almost anything ever had. The door came away from its last hinge easily, rotted through, and behind it was a single room, dry despite everything, protected by an overhang of rock that had kept 60 years of weather mostly at bay. There was a bed frame, collapsed. There was a stove, rusted solid, and against the far wall, half buried under a fall of dust and old cloth, there was a strong box, its lock long since given up to rust. And inside the strong box, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle but intact, there were papers. Silas read slowly, the way a man reads when the reading matters more than it ever has before, and Ada watched his face change by degrees the way weather changes, and when he finally looked up, his voice came out rougher than she'd ever heard it. "This is a land grant," he said, territorial, older than the county line. He turned the paper toward her, though she couldn't read it as fast as he could, and pointed with a finger that wasn't quite steady. "And this is a water right filed to this canyon, and the spring at the head of it, filed by a man named Josiah Amos Calder." Nathaniel, standing very still in the doorway, said, Is that my great-grandfather," Silas said. "I never knew he'd homesteaded down here. Nobody ever said." "Nobody remembered," Ada said quietly. "That's how a thing like this gets lost, not stolen. Just forgotten long enough that it might as well have been." There was more in the box, a second, smaller paper describing the spring itself, its exact location marked in old surveyor's hand, a spring that fed not just this canyon but, if the description held true, the very upper section where Crane's Dam now sat. If the water right was real, If the courthouse still held its match on file the way the box held this copy, then Crane's Dam wasn't merely inconvenient. It was sitting illegally on water that belonged, by a claim 60 years older than his own deed, to the Calder family outright. They found the spring itself 2 hours later, following the surveyor's marks up a side channel of the canyon, a channel that opened, after a quarter-mile of scrambling over rockfall, into a hidden bowl of green the drought hadn't touched at all, grass thick and impossible, cottonwoods heavy with leaf, and at the center of it, welling up clean and cold and endless out of the stone itself, a spring that had been running, unclaimed and unremembered, the whole time anyone in Wickfield had been suffering the drought above. Nathaniel stood at the edge of that green bowl with his hat in his hands, and for the first time since Ada had known him, he laughed. One short, astonished bark of a laugh, and then he pressed the back of his wrist hard against his eyes, and nobody said anything about that either, because some things are better left uncommented on, allowed to simply happen and pass. They did not tell the town right away. Silas rode instead to the county seat, 3 days there and back, to confirm what the box already told him, and the clerk, an old dry stick of a man named Whitfield, who'd kept the county's records for 40 years, pulled a ledger so old the binding cracked when he opened it, and there, faded but legible, was the original filing, matching the copy in the box line for line. "Well, I'll be," Whitfield said more than once, turning pages with the reverence of a man handling something holy. "Calderland right holds the whole canyon spring, and everything downstream of it clear through the upper section. Man who built that dam up there, he's sitting on water. He's got no more claim to than the man in the moon." Silas rode home with the certified copy folded inside his coat, and Ada watched him come up the long drive at dusk, and she knew before he said a word by the way he sat his horse that whatever he'd found had changed something in him beyond the matter of water rights alone. Ward does not stay quiet in a town the size of Wickfield, no matter how carefully you try to hold it, and within the week, Aldous Crane arrived at the Calder Ranch himself, his buggy polished, his hat in his hands in that same performance of humility he always wore like a coat 2 sizes too large for the man underneath. He had, it turned out, already heard rumors, a hidden homestead, an old claim, and he had come, he said, to discuss things amicably, as neighbors, which was Crane's particular gift, dressing a threat up so carefully in the language of kindness that a person could almost miss the knife inside it. "I'm prepared to be generous about the note," he said, standing in the Calder kitchen the way he'd stood there a dozen times before. "Provided we can settle this water business quietly, between ourselves, without the courthouse getting involved and dragging both our names through it." Silas, for the first time in Ada's year in that house, did not let the sentence go unfinished. He looked at Crane for a long moment, and he said, plainly, without heat, "The water rights filed. Whitfield's got the match in the county ledger, dated 60 years before your deed. There's nothing quiet left to settle. You built a dam on land you don't hold water on, and everyone in this valley is going to know it by Sunday, because I intend to tell them myself, at the church steps, in front of God and everybody." Crane's face did something complicated, and for once his practiced kindness had nowhere to land, and he left without his hat fully back on his head, which Ada noted with some private satisfaction was the closest thing to a man fleeing that she had ever personally witnessed. Eugenia Prentice took a different tack, as Ada had known she would, calling on the ranch 2 days later under the pretense of bringing a basket for the children, and delivering, along with the bread and preserves, a long soft-voiced monologue about how the whole town was concerned, simply concerned, about a family digging up old claims in a dangerous canyon, about children being taken down into unstable ground, about whether it was quite proper, quite safe, quite wise, and Ada let her finish every single word of it before she answered, because she had learned that Eugenia Prentice's cruelties lost half their power the moment you refused to interrupt them, and simply let them sit in the room, fully exposed, until they curdled on their own. "We found water," Ada said finally when the woman had run all the way out of soft words. "Real water, filed and legal, That's going to save every acre this family owns, and probably keep half this valley's herds from dying come next dry summer too, since the spring feeds down past our line into the common range. You're welcome to be concerned about that, Mrs. Prentice. If concern is what you'd like to call it, I expect most folks are going to call it something else. Constance, who kept house for the Prentice family and had come along carrying the second basket, said nothing at all in that moment, but Ada saw something shift behind the woman's eyes. A small private recalculation, and she filed that look away the same careful way she filed away Wren's drawings, understanding, without yet knowing why, that it would matter later. The weeks that followed were not without their own trials, because a story like this one does not resolve in a single triumphant afternoon, however much a person might wish it did. There was the matter of the courthouse filing itself, contested first by Crane's lawyer on a technicality about the original grant's boundaries, a fight that cost 3 anxious weeks and every dollar the family could spare on Whitfield's help preparing the paperwork properly. There was the night June's fever spiked so high that Doc Hutchins rode out at 2 in the morning and sat with the child until dawn, Ada holding one small hot hand and Silas pacing the porch outside because he could not make himself sit still with fear the way Ada had learned to. And it was on that porch that Silas finally finished one of his unfinished sentences, turning to Ada in the doorway and saying, "I just wanted to say, I don't know what I'd have done going into that canyon alone. Any of it. Alone." He did not finish it further than that, but he did not need to. And Ada understood it for the vow it was delivered. The way this family delivered everything that mattered, plainly, without ornament, like a fact laid gently on the counter. June's fever broke by morning. Doc Hutchins, packing his bag to leave, paused at the door and said, to no one in particular but loud enough for Ada to hear, that he'd heard about the water claim, and that half the ranchers on the lower range had been quietly praying for exactly this kind of miracle for 2 dry years running, and that whatever the town said about how the Calders had come by it, he for one intended to say plainly that he thought it was Providence repaying a family that had earned it. It was not a large statement, as such things go, but it was the first crack in the dam of Whitfield's collective doubt, and cracks once started tend not to stay small. Wren's breakthrough came on an ordinary Tuesday, in a moment so quiet that Ada almost missed it entirely. The girl had taken to spending afternoons at the mouth of the side canyon where the spring was, sitting on a flat rock with her drawing paper, and on this particular Tuesday Ada had walked out to fetch her for supper and found her not drawing at all but simply sitting watching the water move over stone. The way she always asked without expecting an answer what she saw in the water, Wren had turned to her and said, in a voice gone rusty from disuse but entirely clear, "Mama used to say water remembers everything it's ever touched." It was the first full sentence anyone had heard from her in 2 years, and Ada did not cry, because Ada did not cry where anyone could see her, but she held that small hand very tightly the whole walk back to the house. And that night, for the first time since Ada had come into the family, all 4 children ate supper without a single argument. June included, the toddlers crying finally, blessedly quiet for a full evening, a small barometer reading fair weather at last. Nathaniel's turn came at the town meeting itself, the one Silas had promised to hold at the church steps, though by the time the date arrived the meeting had grown into something closer to a proper gathering of the whole valley. Ranchers who'd suffered the same drought and understood exactly what a restored spring might mean for the common range downstream. Silas stood before that crowd with the certified papers in hand and told the story plainly, without embellishment. The storm, the canyon, the strong bucks, the old claim. And when he was done, it was Nathaniel, unprompted, standing at his father's side, who spoke up and said that he wanted everyone to know. His stepmother had been the one who first saw the shape of that door in the canyon wall, in the dark, in the middle of a storm, when anyone else might have been too frightened to look twice. And he said it plainly. A boy of 12 laying a fact on the counter same as his father would, same as Ada would, and it was the first time he had called her that word, stepmother, in front of anyone. And Ada had to look very hard at the middle distance for a moment before she trusted her own face not to give her away. It was Constance who spoke next, stepping forward from where she'd stood at the edge of the crowd beside Mrs. Brostra. "Prentice," and she said in a voice that shook only slightly, that she had worked in the Prentice house for 11 years and heard 11 years of talk about who deserved what in this valley, and that she had come to believe most of that talk said a good deal more about the people doing the talking than about the people they talked about, and that she, for her part, had never once in 11 years seen Eugenia Prentice ride down into a dark canyon after a family's whole future, storm or no storm. And she thought the valley ought to remember that difference before it decided whose word carried further. Mrs. Prentice's face went the color of old paper, and she did not stay at the church steps a great deal longer after that, and Constance did not go home with her that evening, but instead accepted an invitation to supper at the Calder table, which she took, and returned to accept again more than once in the months that followed. Aldous Crane's dam came down within the month, dismantled under court order, the water flowing free for the first time in 2 years, down through the upper section and out across the common range, and half the ranchers in the valley came by over the following weeks to shake Silas's hand and Ada's both, and more than one of them said, the plain, unadorned way that ranching people say the truest things, that they didn't know what they'd have done another dry season, and that they'd remember this the rest of their lives, whatever the town's gossips chose to say about who deserved credit for it. Ada, true to the deepest habit of her character, tried at every turn to give that credit away to Silas, for having the courage to go down into the canyon at all, to Nathaniel, for holding the fence line steady through every frightened night, to the old surveyor 60 years dead who'd filed the claim in the first place and never lived to see it matter. But Silas would not let her fully give it away this time, not entirely, and one evening on the porch with Wren arranging stones along the rail beside them, and June finally asleep before dark for the first time in a year, he took Ada's rope-scarred hand in both of his and said the whole sentence through, without a single word left unfinished. "I just wanted to say," he said, "that I have spent 2 years believing this family was something broken, that I was simply managing, day to day, so it wouldn't fall in on itself entirely. And I didn't understand until that storm, until I watched you hold a lantern, steady in the rain, and see a door in the dark that I'd have ridden straight past. I didn't understand that a family isn't a thing you manage. It's a thing you build together out of whoever shows up and stays. You showed up, and you stayed. And I don't intend to let a single day go by from here on that I don't say so plainly." Ada did not cry. She held to her rule, the one rule she had never broken in 34 years, but she came, in the months that followed, to understand that rule differently than she once had, not as a wall built to keep grief and softness out entirely, but as a kind of discipline that had let her survive long enough to reach a house and a canyon, worth finally softening. For the years that came after were not without their own ordinary troubles, the way every life carries ordinary troubles, regardless of how the extraordinary ones resolve. But the spring in the hidden canyon ran clean and constant through every summer that followed, and the Calder herd grew back past its old numbers within 3 seasons, and the ranch that had nearly gone under became in time one the valley pointed to when it wanted to explain to newcomers what the word Providence actually looked like out here. On ground this dry, in country this hard. Old Pop Ezra, who had lived in the valley longer than anyone and had a story for every stretch of ground in it, took to telling the tale himself in later years, sitting on the mercantile porch with his pipe, to whoever would sit still long enough to listen. He told it the way old men tell the stories that matter most to them, slowly, with digressions, circling back twice to the same detail before moving forward again, and he always ended it the same way, tapping his pipe against the porch rail for emphasis. "Funniest thing about that canyon," he'd say, "is folks spent 30 years calling it Widow's Throat and teaching their children to fear it, on account of an old story half of us couldn't even properly recall anymore. Turned out the thing we'd spent 30 years fearing was the very thing that saved us, sitting there the whole time, waiting on somebody brave enough, or desperate enough, or maybe just loving enough, to follow their cattle down into the dark and find it. He'd pause there, letting the smoke clear, and add almost to himself, "Homes like that, too, I've come to think. Sometimes you don't recognize the thing that's going to save you, until you've gone down into the hard, dark part of it looking for something else entirely, and found instead that the ground beneath your feet was holding water all along, deeper than the drought, deeper than the fear, deeper than anybody's memory of why they were ever afraid of it in the first place. All it ever needed was somebody willing to go down and look." And that, more or less, is how the valley remembered it in the years that followed, whenever the story got told again around a supper table or a mercantile porch, not as a tale about water rights or dams or old paper in a rusted box, though it was certainly about all of those things too, but as a tale about a house that had been, for 2 long years, only a place 4 grieving children and 1 silent man happened to sleep, and how it became, slowly, through storms weathered and canyons entered and rules quietly softened, the one thing none of them had ever quite dared call it aloud until the night it finally, truly, was won: home.